I didn't say a word when they shoved that eviction notice into my hands. The paper trembled a little, but not from me. It was from the clerk, who already knew this wasn't right. Instead of arguing, I slid an old yellow document across the table. Pops's 1923 water rights deed. The room went silent. Nobody had expected that. And in that moment I knew those 35 shiny new McMansions downstream had just become lakefront property. The estate's HOA thought they could erase me, thought they could swallow my grandfather's land while I was half a world away in Afghanistan. They'd paved cow pastures, poured concrete where deer trails used to be, and replaced neighbors with committees. They strutted around in golf carts, tennis visors pulled tight like crowns, acting like their little empire was permanent. What they didn't realize, I wasn't just some soldier coming home with memories. I was Army Corps of Engineers. And that little earth dam Pops had built 45 years earlier, it was more than a pond. It was a fuse. And these people were about to learn what happens when you build paradise on borrowed ground. But let me take you back, because to really understand what went down, you've got to know the land first. The summer of 2023 was brutal in Texas. The kind of heat that curls paint off fence posts and leaves dust hanging in the air long after a truck passes. I came back from my second tour, duffel bag in the back seat, the smell of sand and gun oil still clinging to my clothes. I drove down that old gravel road, past the oak tree where I'd carved my initials at 12, expecting to see rolling pastures, cattle trails, and Pops's dam glinting in the sun. Instead, I heard it first, jackhammers, the low growl of diesel engines. Then I saw them, concrete trucks, survey stakes stabbing into the earth like bayonets, crews in neon vests walking across my family's back 40 acres. My acres. My chest went tight. Gravel crunched louder than it should have under my boots as I marched up to a foreman who barely looked at me. "Sorry, buddy," he said, wiping sweat off his forehead without meeting my eyes. "We got permits. This is estate's property now." Buddy, that word. Like I was a stranger trespassing on the only ground that's ever felt like home. I called the sheriff's office. Officer Martinez showed up, hands on his belt, eyes uneasy. He explained almost apologetically that the HOA had filed something called an adverse possession claim while I was deployed. Old Texas law meant to keep land from sitting idle, now twisted by developers into a weapon. If no one actively used the land and they could prove improvements, they could claim it, just like that. And that's when she appeared. 52, HOA president. She came gliding up in her little golf cart like it was a throne on wheels. Tennis skirt, pearls, that kind of sugary sweet southern drawl that's equal parts hospitality and poison. "Your family abandoned this land, honey," she said, leaning on the wheel like she was chatting about the weather. "We're just putting it to good use for the community." Behind her I saw the creek, the one Pops's dam fed, except it wasn't feeding it anymore. Screw had diverted it. The water level in the dam was falling. Every day it dropped was 45 years of my grandfather's work, 45 years of neighbors depending on that reservoir during droughts, being stolen gallon by gallon. "You should stayed closer to home, soldier boy," called out as her cart rolled away. Those words cut deeper than any enemy round ever had. That's when I knew this wasn't just about dirt, it wasn't even about money. This was war. I tried a lawyer, big mistake. He quoted me $85,000 just to challenge the zoning change. Turns out, husband Rick, a city councilman, had already greased the wheels. My agricultural land had been emergency rezoned into residential development while I was overseas. Conflict of interest didn't even begin to cover it. So I did what I'd been trained to do. I started digging. Not trenches this time, records, county filings, permits, old maps. And one afternoon, buried in a dusty courthouse box, I found it. Pops's original dam construction permit, stamped by the Army Corps of Engineers, which meant one thing: federal jurisdiction couldn't touch it. And then deeper in the stacks, I found the real grenade. A 1923 water rights deed signed by my great-grandfather. Senior rights to the entire Willow Creek watershed, older than the county. Older than every one of those stucco palaces was planting on my soil. That was the moment I realized they hadn't just stolen my land, they stolen my water. And in Texas, that's a fight you don't walk away from. The metallic taste of adrenaline hit my tongue when I held that deed in my hands. The ink was faded, the edges brittle, but the authority was undeniable. My great-grandfather had bought senior water rights for Willow Creek a century ago, older than the city, older than the county's water board, stronger than every flimsy permit and Rick had cooked up behind closed doors. For the first time since stepping onto that construction site, I felt the ground shift back under my boots. This wasn't just a fight I could win. This was a fight I was born to fight. But while I was piecing together my family's legacy in dusty courthouse archives, was busy painting me as the villain. I'll never forget the first time I saw her on the evening news. She stood there in her manicured lawn, hair perfect, voice trembling with just the right amount of rehearsed sorrow. Behind her, the homes have gleamed like a stage set. "We're just concerned about the children's safety," she said, dabbing her eyes with a tissue she didn't need. "That dam looks ready to burst. Families live downstream. Innocent lives are at risk." The camera panned to a couple of nervous-looking neighbors clutching toddlers on their hips, nodding solemnly. They didn't know what they were part of. They just wanted to be good neighbors. And just like that, the narrative shifted. Jake wasn't a veteran coming home to reclaim his family land. I was the unstable soldier hoarding a dangerous dam, threatening suburban peace. The kicker, that dam had passed every safety inspection with flying colors. Pops built it with Army Corps engineers. It was solid, safer than half the culverts running under Austin's highways. But the news didn't care about facts. They cared about ratings, and knew it. That week I started noticing cars slowing down at my gate. Phones held up, snapping pictures. My name never appeared in her posts on the app, but she didn't have to name me. She wrote about unstable individuals making threats and property disputes with aggressive veterans. And in a neighborhood that small, everyone knew who she meant. At night, the air was heavy with diesel fumes from the crews working double shifts. They were racing to finish foundations before I could get traction in court. Every morning, I'd wake up to the sound of a new truck rattling down the gravel road, cement mixing, rebar clanging. Every night, I'd watch the dam's water line drop another inch, my grandfather's reservoir bleeding out like a wound. That's when I called Tony. Tony was an old army buddy. We'd hauled gear together across Afghan deserts, drinking water warm enough to taste like tin. After the service, he joined the EPA's enforcement division. If anyone knew how to turn a water dispute into a federal case, it was him. "Jake," he said, his voice calm but firm. "If they diverted a natural waterway without permits, that's a straight-up Clean Water Act violation. And if your dam was built under federal jurisdiction," he didn't even finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I grabbed a notebook and started doing what soldiers do best, documenting. Trail cameras on the property line, time-stamped photos of every crew working on the creek, flow measurements 3 times a day at 3 different points. My boots were caked in red clay, my clothes damp with creek water, but the evidence piled up. Meanwhile, the harassment turned from subtle to suffocating. Organized something she called a safety patrol. 3 HOA board members in matching polo shirts, sitting in lawn chairs at my driveway like wannabe gate guards. They jotted down license plates, questioned delivery drivers, even tried to photograph my sister Sarah when she flew in from California to check on me. The citations came next. Loud music complaints when I ran the radio during chores. Notices about unsightly structures aimed at my old farmhouse that had stood proud since 1962. A septic inspection despite the system passing only 6 months earlier. The worst blow was when Rick used his city council seat to order a wellness check. He told Veteran Services I was a troubled soldier struggling to adjust. The social worker who knocked on my door was kind, but she had a clipboard and boxes she had to check. And there, just beyond the oak tree, sat in her golf cart, watching the inspection like it was a parade. I clenched my fists so hard my nails left marks in my palms. That wasn't just an insult. That was weaponizing my service against me. But if they thought I'd fold, they didn't know me. Because as their pressure campaign escalated, my evidence file thickened. And the deeper I dug, the uglier it got. In the county records, I found floodplain maps marked in bright red. Turns out every single one of homes was planted squarely in a 100-year flood zone. Insurance companies had refused coverage until Rick's council pushed through a flood mitigation plan. The plan? Redirect Willow Creek permanently into my property. In other words, let me take the flood so their houses could stay dry. That wasn't just greed, that was fraud. The smell of cedar pollen clung to my shirt as I pored over the files late into the night, courthouse coffee going cold beside me. And with every page I turned, my anger grew sharper, more focused. This wasn't just being a petty suburban dictator, this was systematic theft. Land, water, and now truth itself. Standing on my porch one night, flashlight in hand, I watched the creek trickle weakly into Pops's reservoir. The air buzzed with cicadas, the dam's surface reflecting a thin slice of moonlight. My neighbors downstream, Santos, Mrs., had already lost their farms and gardens when that creek dried up. And I realized then, this fight wasn't about me anymore. This was about every neighbor who once leaned on Pops's dam during drought, about every family whose roots ran deeper than any HOA covenant, about a legacy written not in concrete, but in water. I tightened my grip on the deed. My grandfather had left me more than land. He'd left me the weapon I needed. And it was time to learn how to fire it. It started with a phone call just past midnight. Static on the line, then Tony's voice cutting through like a drill sergeant. Jake, listen, if they're diverting that creek without federal permits, you've got them cold. Document everything, dates, times, water flow, don't miss a thing. I already had trail cameras strapped to cedar posts. Every truck that rolled in, every worker laying pipe where no pipe belonged, it was all on film. I scribbled measurements in a weather-beaten notebook, creek width, dam levels, flow rates. I logged the crunch of tires in the gravel, the smell of diesel in the air, the faint vibration of bulldozers rattling my window panes at night. But evidence alone wasn't enough, was tightening her noose. The harassment campaign grew bolder. Loud music citations, a wellness check that nearly landed me in handcuffs, and then the day I came back from town to find 3 HOA board members camped at my gate, folding chairs in a neat little row, clipboards resting on their laps like rifles. They waved as I drove past, their smiles sharp as barbed wire. One snapped my license plate like he was bagging a trophy. That night, I sat at the kitchen table under the yellow light of Pops's old lantern, thumbing through records until my fingers were black with courthouse dust. And that's when I found it. Floodplain maps, bright red zones bleeding across the page. Every home sat dead center in a 100-year floodplain, and the only reason they'd been insured was because Rick pushed through a bogus flood mitigation plan. Their solution? Redirect Willow Creek into my land. Turn my reservoir into their personal drainage ditch. That wasn't just shady politics. That was fraud. The deeper I dug, the uglier it got. Rick's company had been behind zoning changes in half a dozen redeveloped neighborhoods over the last 3 years. And she had a history, a paper trail from Houston where her last HOA had quietly paid millions in fines for, you guessed it, illegal creek diversions. She hadn't learned her lesson. She just skipped town and started again. And here's the thing about secrets, they don't stay buried forever. I wasn't alone in this fight, not anymore. First, there was Mrs., 80 years old, sharp as a tack, with a garden that used to be the pride of the valley, until diversion left her cucumbers withered and her peach trees dying in the Texas sun. She came by one evening, a shoebox of black and white photos in her arms, her grandfather standing in front of that same creek in 1942, kids splashing in the current, water that had fed her family's soil for generations. You hold on to these, she said, pressing the photos into my hands. They'll try to tell you this water doesn't belong to you, but you and I, we know better. Then came Santos. His family farm had been rezoned out of existence 2 years earlier, swallowed by one of Rick's redevelopment projects. He told me how his father used Willow Creek for irrigation since 1887. He showed me faded ledgers where his grandfather had recorded every planting season, each one tied to the creek's flow. This isn't just your fight, said, slamming his calloused hand against my table. It's ours too. She's been stealing from all of us. Their voices gave me strength, and their stories gave me ammunition. But wasn't done. She doubled down with a smear campaign, A local paper ran a story with my photo plastered across the front page. The headline, "Troubled Veteran Blocks Community Progress." They made my farmhouse look like a shack, angled the photo just right so it cast long, sinister shadows. Then came the stunt, a photo op staged like theater. 20 mothers clutching children lined up at my property line with handmade signs, "Protect our kids." A professional photographer crouched in the ditch, snapping shots of their worried faces. And front and center, arms outstretched, pointing at my dam like it was a loaded weapon. The Facebook post went viral before sundown. Protect Our Kids flooded the feed. And suddenly I was Jake, landowner. I was a danger, a villain, a headline waiting to happen. That night I sat in Pops's chair on the porch, the cicadas buzzing, my notebook heavy in my lap. I flipped to the deed again. The 1923 signature still clear, ink dark against the brittle page. Great-grandfather hadn't left me money or oil rights. He'd left me water, senior water rights, stronger than any HOA covenant. And as I listened to the hum of construction in the dark, I realized had made her mistake. She thought she was fighting a man, but she was fighting history. Still, I knew history alone wouldn't save me. I needed allies in places that mattered, so I picked up the phone and called Cross, environmental lawyer, pro-specialist, the kind of attorney who lived to dismantle crooked schemes. When she walked my property for the first time, boots crunching in the gravel, she paused at the dam, running her hand along Pops's old concrete spillway. "You don't just have a case," she said, eyes glinting in the sun. "You've got a war chest." Together we began building something couldn't touch. A coalition, farmers with generations of claims, environmental groups eager to protect nesting birds diversion had wiped out. Regulators Tony had on speed dial. Piece by piece, we stitched together a case as strong as steel. Meanwhile, I upgraded the dam, serviced the gates, checked every hydraulic line. Pops had built it to last, and it had. But I wanted it ready, because deep down I knew this fight wasn't ending in a courtroom. This fight would end with water. The smell of WD-40 clung to my hands as I tightened bolts by flashlight, storm clouds building on the horizon. Thought she could bully me out, smear me, bury me under paperwork. She'd underestimated what a man will do to protect what's his. And as thunder rumbled in the distance, I whispered to the night, "You started this war, now let's see how you handle the flood." The storm clouds rolled in the way trouble always does, slow at first, then suddenly everywhere. By the end of September, the air was heavy, buzzing with electricity, and so was I. Because now I wasn't just gathering evidence, I was building a plan. Pops's dam had been sitting quiet for decades, but it wasn't just a pond wall, it was a machine. The original Army Corps design included hydraulic spillway gates meant to release water in a controlled flow. Pops used them sparingly, usually in drought years to help the Santos farm or refill Mrs. Garden, but those gates hadn't been opened in 40 years, until now. I spent nights testing the mechanisms by flashlight. The smell of hydraulic oil clung to my hands, WD-40 staining my jeans. Each time I pulled a lever, the old gears groaned but held. When water trickled through the underground spill channels for the first time in decades, the echo carried like a promise. Pops had built it to last, and it had. Meanwhile went nuclear. She started with a safety patrol. 20 residents with folding chairs and coolers parked themselves by my property line. They waved signs that read "Protect Our Kids." Every movement I made like they were catching a terrorist in action. Then came the bureaucratic blitz. Building inspectors, fire marshals, animal control, all in the same week. Each one walked my farmhouse with a clipboard jotting down violations. The front porch needed $8,000 in foundation work. The barn needed an electrical upgrade. Even my old septic system, perfectly fine 6 months ago, was suddenly a hazard. I knew the tactic. It was the same in Afghanistan. Overwhelm the target with pressure from all sides until they break. Except they forgot one thing: I'd been trained not to break. And the more they pushed, the more allies I found. The society joined in when they discovered creek diversion had destroyed nesting grounds for 3 protected bird species. Texas Parks and Wildlife confirmed a fish kill in Willow Creek. A native bass population wiped out. But that report, somehow it had been lost in Rick's office before reaching federal hands. My lawyer nearly laughed when she read that. They just committed federal obstruction. That's prison time, Jake. The walls were starting to close in on, and she knew it, which meant she got desperate. One night, my trail cameras caught two men in tactical vests creeping around the dam. They weren't your average rent-a-cops. These guys had the look former contractors, now hired muscle. One carried a bag of quickset concrete, the other kept watch with a radio. Their plan? Jam the hydraulic lines so the gates would lock, turning my dam into a useless slab of dirt. But what they didn't know, Deputy had been waiting. Tony had tipped him off about sabotage attempts, and that night he crouched in the mesquite shadows with his flashlight ready. The arrest was almost comical. Imagine two wannabe soldiers, hands zip-tied, trying to explain why they were pouring concrete into a federally registered flood control system at 2 in the morning. Their excuse? They were protecting the community. Yeah, from water. The sabotage attempt rattled me, not because I doubted my dam, but because it showed just how far was willing to go. She wasn't fighting fair anymore. She was fighting dirty. And then came her strike yet. I woke up to find a VA social worker at my door, clipboard in hand, soft eyes full of pity. Someone had called claiming I'd made suicide threats, that I was unstable, dangerous, a risk to myself and others, the kind of call that can put a veteran in a 72-hour involuntary hold. And just beyond the oak tree, there she was, sitting smug in her golf cart, sunglasses reflecting the sunrise as if she were watching a show she'd directed. It took every ounce of control not to march over and rip those glasses off her face. I managed to convince the social worker I was fine, that I wasn't a threat. She left, apologetic, but I knew the damage was done. Didn't need me institutionalized. She just needed me branded unstable in the eyes of the community. That night, Sarah called from California. Her voice cracked through the phone. Jake, please, don't let them push you too far. Don't do something that'll get you locked up. Pops wouldn't want that. I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the dam out my window, storm clouds building above it. Sarah, I finally said, my voice low, steady. Pops built this dam to help people. That's what I'm gonna do. Because by then, the decision was made. The spillway gates weren't a weapon. They were proof. Proof of how water flowed before diverted it. Proof of how her shiny development sat on a fraud. The storm was coming, and when it hit, I was going to open those gates. Not out of revenge, not to destroy, but to restore, to show the creek where it belonged, to show the world who was really unstable. And as thunder rolled low across the Texas hills, I whispered the words I'd been carrying for months. Sometimes you have to flood the valley to save the creek. The morning of the operation didn't feel like war. It felt like calm before a storm, the kind of quiet you get when the cicadas go silent, when even the birds seem to hold their breath. I'd been up all night tightening bolts, checking hydraulic lines, reviewing flow calculations in Pops's old notebook. Every measurement had to be precise. Too much pressure and I'd flood the valley. Too little and would claim the whole thing was a stunt. At 5:30 a.m., just as dawn streaked the sky pink, there was a knock at my door. A VA social worker again. Last card. She told them I'd made imminent suicide threats. If I hadn't been ready, that could have been the end. A 72-hour hold me locked away while spun her story. But I was calm, focused. I answered every question, showed her my plans, my notebooks, the warning signs I'd already posted downstream. She saw the preparation, the discipline. She left shaking her head at the false report. And there, watching from her golf cart, smile finally cracked. By 7:00 a.m., federal trucks rolled up. EPA inspectors, clipboards, cameras. Agent Sarah, stone-faced, introduced herself and asked to see the spillway. Perfect timing. Santos showed with his family. Mrs. came in her Sunday best, clutching photos of her grandfather's garden. My lawyer set up folding tables with copies of every deed, every permit. We weren't just fighting, we were presenting. This was a demonstration. Across the creek, her troops. 20 residents with folding chairs, coolers, protect our kids' signs. Their phones live-streamed as if they were filming a terrorist attack. She stood at the front, pearls glinting in the sun, voice sharp as she barked at the cameras. "He's flooding our children's homes. This unstable veteran is using military training to weaponize water." I wanted to laugh, because not a single drop had been released yet. At 7:02 a.m., I gripped the steel lever, Pops's old handwriting in my pocket. "Open spillway today. Help neighbors, that's what we do." I pulled. The gates groaned, old hydraulics shuddering. And then the sound. Not a violent roar, but a steady, low rush, like a deep breath after years of holding it in. Water spilled, then flowed, then surged into its natural bed, carving back into the channel where it belonged. For the first time in 18 months, Willow Creek was alive. The inspectors measured flow rates, nodding. Dropped to his knees, scooping the water in his calloused hands, tears cutting tracks down his dusty cheeks. "This is the water that fed my grandfather's farm for 60 years, he whispered. Across the lines, voice rose to hysteria. She pointed, screamed at the agents. "Arrest him, he's flooding our homes, he's dangerous." But the homes didn't flood, not one. The water stayed where it always had, within the banks of the original creek. Mrs. Irrigation ditches filled for the first time in over a year. Downstream farms reported their stock ponds brimming again. Even the birds seemed to return, darting low over the rippling surface. News helicopters circled overhead, cameras rolling. Reporters swarmed table, flipping through the records. One anchor asked the obvious question, pointing to the flowing creek. "Ma'am, if this is the original waterway, how is this flooding?" For the first time, stuttered. Rick tried to salvage it, dialing frantically, yelling into his phone about millions in property value destroyed. He didn't realize was recording the call right there, his voice carrying through the speaker as he raged about that psycho flooding our investments. Agent didn't flinch. She measured the flow, checked my logs, then turned to the cameras. "This release matches historical seasonal patterns. This is proper water management, not a threat." And just like that, the narrative cracked. Neighbors who'd come to watch me, terrorize, the valley began packing their coolers, folding their chairs. Even a few families looked confused, muttering to themselves as they left. But wasn't done. She screamed across the creek, voice raw, "You've destroyed everything. 35 families will suffer because of you." I didn't yell back. I just spoke steady, loud enough for every microphone to catch it. "No, ma'am, I restored everything. Your families can buy water rights legally, just like the rest of us have to." That line hit harder than any flood. Because the truth was now visible, undeniable. The water itself told the story. Still tried one more move. 3 concrete trucks rolled up fast, men jumping out, preparing to accidentally spill their loads across the creek bed to block the flow. But federal agents were ready. They cuffed the drivers on the spot. Interfering with a federal environmental inspection is a felony. Not even Rick's city council buddies could cover that up. By 10 a.m., the creek was running steady. No floods, no destruction, just restoration. EPA confirmed it in writing. Local farmers confirmed it with tears in their eyes, and the news broadcast it live. His face was red, her voice shrill, her pearl necklace trembling as she shouted into cameras that refused to believe her anymore. And me, I stood at the spillway, boots muddy, hands slick with hydraulic oil, the sun warming my shoulders. Pops's journal pressed against my chest pocket. This wasn't revenge, this was justice, the kind that doesn't roar, it flows. The courthouse smelled like old paper and burnt coffee, the kind of smell that seeps into your clothes, sticks to your skin. I walked in wearing a simple button-down, jeans, and Pops's old cowboy hat. No suit, no tie. I didn't need to dress like someone else. She swept through the doors in pearls and a black dress, flanked by a wall of attorneys in 3-piece suits. Her husband Rick marched beside her, jaw tight, eyes darting. Their army of lawyers carried rolling cases stuffed with binders, charts, and glossy photographs designed to bury me under paperwork. The gallery was split like a church on the brink of civil war. On one side, HOA residents clutching protect our kids signs. On the other, farmers with weathered faces, families who'd lost water, Mrs. clutching her shoebox of photographs, standing tall with his ledger of family records. The tension crackled as the bailiff called the court to order. Judge presided, Rick's golfing buddy, a man whose campaign had been fattened with checks. I could see the sweat shining on his forehead even before the first gavel hit. His lawyer opened like it was theater. He held up glossy photos of muddy yards, claimed $2.7 million in flood damage. He rolled in a psychiatrist who had never met me but confidently diagnosed combat revenge fantasies. He painted me as an unhinged veteran turning water into a weapon of mass destruction. The whispers rippled through the courtroom. I sat still, hands folded, breathing steady. I'd heard worse in Afghanistan, accusations, lies, propaganda. And just like there, the truth had its own weight. When it was turn, she rose calmly, her voice sharp enough to cut marble. She laid Pops's 1978 flood covenant on the bench, a legal obligation to maintain seasonal flows downstream. Then she handed over the EPA's fresh inspection results confirming my release matched historical creek patterns exactly. She didn't stop there. Historical photographs, maps, records. One by one, she stacked the truth higher than's tower of lies. And then came Tony, EPA enforcement officer, Army buddy. He took the stand with the kind of calm that only comes from knowing you've got the facts in your pocket. He, the HOA, had diverted a natural waterway illegally, committed Clean Water Act violations, and obstructed federal wildlife reports. Rick squirmed in his chair, his lawyer whispering frantically. Judge looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Wasn't finished. She called Rick himself to the stand. Under oath, his arrogance cracked. He admitted to pushing zoning changes while I was overseas, admitted his financial ties to the construction company, and when played the recording of him screaming into his phone about destroying property values, the gallery gasped. "This is a federal setup," Rick shouted, face red, voice cracking. He stood, nearly knocking over his chair. "We did nothing wrong." The judge banged his gavel, demanding order, but the damage was done. Rick's own words had convicted him in the eyes of everyone watching. The real gut punch came from the community. Santos took the stand, voice rough, steady. He described 3 generations of farming destroyed when the creek dried up. He held up his grandfather's ledger, voice breaking as he read the notes about planting seasons tied to water flow. Mrs. followed. She laid out her black and white photos, her garden lush in the 1940s, her crops withered in the present. Her quiet dignity filled the room louder than any lawyer's speech. Fire Chief Martinez that my spillway operation was the most controlled and professional water release he'd ever witnessed. No homes flooded, no danger, just restoration. When it was turned, she tried her old tricks, tears, trembling fingers pointing at me. "He came back from war damaged, Your Honor. He's terrorizing families with psychological warfare." But her voice cracked. Her performance fell flat against the weight of evidence stacked higher than her lies. Finally called me. I stood, Pops's journal in my hand. My voice carried steady through the courtroom. "I didn't flood anybody," I said. "I restored a creek that was stolen. This water belonged here long before estates ever existed. My grandfather built that dam for the community, and I'll honor his legacy before I let anyone bury it under concrete." Silence settled in the room. Even the HOA side shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Then dropped the final hammer, documentation of Houston HOA paying $2.3 million in EPA fines for the exact same scheme. And with that, the federal prosecutor in the back row stood and announced an investigation into interstate water fraud. The gallery erupted. Reporters scribbled, cameras flashed. Judge banged his gavel again, sweat dripping down his temple. He tried to keep control, but the tide had turned. When he finally spoke, his voice wavered. He Olive's restraining order requests, ruled my spillway operation lawful, and ordered the HOA to cease interference with federal environmental enforcement. Then he looked straight at Rick. "This court will not obstruct federal law. Not today, not ever." The bailiff escorted Rick out as banking investigators served fresh warrants. tried to hide her face behind a scarf, but the reporters swarmed her anyway. Her pearls gleamed under the camera flashes like chains. I walked out the courthouse doors to the sound of farmers cheering, kids laughing, and neighbors clapping me on the back. Announced the federal RICO investigation to the press right there on the steps. Hugged me, Mrs. slipped her old photos into my hand, tears in her eyes. And me, I just tipped my hat, boots crunching on the courthouse steps. Because this fight wasn't about me winning. It was about the truth finally flowing free. Justice doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it trickles in slow, steady, like water reclaiming its channel. 6 months after that courthouse showdown, Estates was unrecognizable. Not because of the houses still standing, but because of what wasn't. The HOA was gone, dissolved, bankrupt, had been hit with $8.7 million in civil penalties she couldn't pay, her BMW repossessed, her tennis outfits auctioned off in some dingy warehouse. Rick, he pleaded guilty to federal conspiracy charges and started a 3-year stint in a federal prison, trading his golf clubs for a jumpsuit. The construction company folded under the weight of $12 million in EPA fines. Their federal contracts revoked, their investors scattered like vultures startled off a carcass. And those shiny new McMansions, half-finished shells, some stripped bare by banks, others left to rot in the Texas sun. Nature was reclaiming them faster than foreclosure could. Weeds snaked up driveways, kudzu creeping over vinyl siding. They looked less like homes and more like monuments to greed. But my land, different story. With federal protection stamped across the deed and Pops's water covenant reaffirmed, my property value soared. From the lowball $180,000 had tried to bribe me with, to $1.2 million under its new designation. Not that I cared about the number. What mattered was the security, the permanence. This land would never be stolen again. And I didn't keep the winnings for myself. When the state awarded me a $340,000 settlement from the insurance fraud investigation, I used it to buy his farm back at tax auction and gave it straight back to him, free of debt. Watching his family return to land they thought they'd lost forever. That was worth more than any payout. Mrs. Garden came alive again, cucumbers sprawling on trellises, peach trees heavy with fruit. She turned her plot into a teaching garden, local kids running through rows of tomatoes, while she lectured them about soil and heritage in that sharp, no-nonsense voice of hers. The creek itself, it bloomed. Birds returned within months, 12 new species documented by the society. Fish stocks rebounded, the bass population back to levels biologists hadn't seen in decades. Texas Parks and Wildlife officially designated Willow Creek a protected wildlife corridor. And for the first time in years, people came not to build, but to marvel. Kayakers, bird watchers, kids catching frogs at the water's edge. The kind of community Pops had dreamed of, not the kind tried to manufacture with gates and bylaws. Every Sunday, I took a mason jar down to the creek, filled it with clear water and carried it to Pops's grave. Set it down by his headstone and whispered, "She's singing again, Pops, just like you said she would." But the fight didn't just stay here. Word of what happened spread. Other towns called, other farmers, people who'd been steamrolled by HOAs, developers, crooked councils. They wanted to know how we fought back, what documents we used, what strategies worked. And I started taking those calls. Some nights I sat on the porch, boots kicked up, phone pressed to my ear, telling some farmer in Arkansas the same words Tony told me. Document everything. Don't quit. The law is stronger than you think. We even started a fund, the Pops Water Rights Scholarship, to help rural students study environmental engineering. His daughter Maria was the first recipient. She told me at a barbecue one night, "I'm gonna protect creeks like this all over Texas, Jake. People like won't stand a chance." I believed her. As for me, let's just say fighting side by side in a war like this forges something deeper than partnership. By the following spring, we held the first annual Creek Days Festival. Food tents lined the bank, farmers selling produce grown with water they'd thought was gone forever. Kids splashed in the shallows, veterans manned grills, bands played under string lights hung from oak trees. We raised enough money that weekend to fund legal defenses for 6 more communities under siege. And the festival ended with everyone lighting lanterns, setting them afloat on the water as the current carried them downstream, little flames drifting through the night, glowing like stars. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was a movement, one dam, one creek, one stubborn veteran with Pops's journals, and it had spread like wildfire. Because at the end of the day had been right about one thing. I did bring something back from Afghanistan, not weapons, not destruction, but the knowledge that communities only survive when they stand together. That water, like justice, always finds its way back. And standing there on the bank, lanterns glowing, neighbors laughing, I realized Pops didn't just leave me land. He left me a mission. And I'd finally answered it. The funny thing about water is, it never forgets where it's supposed to go. You can dam it, block it, twist its course for a while, but sooner or later it finds its channel again. Justice is the same way. Almost a year had passed since that day in court, and I still woke up some mornings expecting to hear the sound of jackhammers on my land. But instead, I heard the creek. The steady, low rush of water over rock. Birds calling at dawn. The creak of my porch swing when I sat with a cup of black coffee, boots dusty, sun breaking over the hills. Life had slowed, but it hadn't stopped. The McMansions left behind didn't stay empty for long. A few families stayed after the HOA collapsed. They weren't bad people, just caught in the storm. Without the board breathing down their necks, some even crossed the property line to say hello. The first time it happened, I was hauling hay bales into the barn when a man in khakis shuffled up, hat in his hands. He looked nervous. "Mister," he said, we were told you hated us, but now I see it. You just wanted what was fair." I nodded, didn't say much, just offered him a cold beer from the cooler. Sometimes that's all it takes to start rewriting history. The real rewriting happened in the schools. And I visited the local high school to talk about water rights, history, land stewardship. Kids who used to roll their eyes at civics now leaned forward, listening. One boy asked, "So you beat the HOA because your grandpa wrote it down?" I smiled. I beat them because he never gave up. Writing it down was just part of it. That's when it hit me, Pops had left me more than land and a dam. He'd left me a story. And stories, if you tell them right, outlive laws and walls. By the Second Creek Days festival, word had spread. People drove in from 3 counties over. Not just farmers, but city folk, students, veterans, even lawyers who wanted to volunteer. We raised money for water restoration projects in Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Kansas. Called it a grassroots hydrology revolution. I just called it Pops's way spreading out. But even as the movement grew, I kept my rituals. Every Sunday morning, I still carried a mason jar of creek water to Pops's grave, set it down, tip my hat, and tell him what had happened that week. Sometimes it was victories, sometimes it was setbacks, always it was thanks. Because without his stubbornness, without the foresight to write his rights in ink 100 years ago, none of this would happen. The last time I went, the sun was setting, turning the sky orange and purple. I leaned on the headstone, whispered, "We did it, Pops. We turned a fight into a future." And I swear, for just a moment, I could hear him chuckle in the wind. The truth is, and Rick weren't the first to try something like this, and they won't be the last. Greed is patient. It waits for cracks, for distractions, for someone to be gone long enough to snatch what isn't theirs. But now there's a blueprint, a way for ordinary people to push back. It's not about having power, it's about having patience. It's not about flooding valleys, it's about restoring streams. And it's not about revenge, it's about balance. Sometimes the strongest people aren't the ones who shout the loudest or fight the hardest. They're the ones who hold their ground quietly until the flood washes away the lies. That's what this story became. Not the story of a veteran and his dam, not the story of an HOA gone rotten, but the story of a community rediscovering itself, of water reclaiming its path, of justice flowing, steady and relentless back where it belonged. And if you ever drive down that gravel road on a summer evening, you'll see it for yourself. The dam still standing, stronger than ever. The creek running clear, Kids laughing as they splash at the banks. Farmers leaning on fences, tipping hats as they watch their fields drink deep. Lanterns floating downstream on creek days, glowing like stars scattered across the water. And maybe, if you stand still long enough, you'll hear it too, that low, steady song Pops used to talk about. The sound of a creek that refused to be silenced. The sound of justice finding its way home. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next mystery on HOA Hunter Stories.